Welcome, everybody. My name is Jackie Dang. I'm an educational developer here at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. And today we are continuing on with our SoTL workshop series. And so SoTL stands for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. We've had two workshops so far focused on SoTL. So the first was an introduction to SoTL, and the second, which was in December, was crafting effective research questions for SoTL. And so this is the first workshop in the series that's going to dive into more detail regarding the methods behind SoTL. And so we'll focus on one approach to SoTL, which is qualitative methods. And specifically, we'll be diving into how you might facilitate and organize interviews and focus groups. There is a copy of the slides that I've made shared, so you can scan the QR code that you see on the slide to get access to these slides to follow along. And there's also a link to the slides in the chat. We're going to be covering quite a bit of information today. We only have an hour, and qualitative methods in SoTL and in social science research more broadly is a huge field in itself. And so we're definitely not going to have enough time to dive into everything. But there are references in this slide deck that you can dive more deeply into yourself. The idea with these slides is that you can take them and use them as your own reference material later on as you progress in your SoTL journey. So yeah, with that, let's dive right in. I'm presenting today from the Dish with One Spoon territory. So the Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bounded to share the territory and protect the land in which I work and live on, and presumably many of you also work and live on. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirits of friendship and peace, friendship, and respect. I often worry about how performative things like land acknowledgements can be and can become. And so if you're interested in learning more and perhaps doing more in the spirit of Indigenous reconciliation, I encourage you to check out some of the resources here at the bottom of this slide. So nativeland.ca, which is a resource that helps you sort of identify which people's lands you might be occupying. The Yellowhead Institute, the Standing Strong Task Force here at TMU, and then some Indigenous TMU resources related to education. This workshop can be counted towards the Excellence in Teaching program. So as part of this program, you're expected to complete a set number of workshops or participate in a set number of workshops. This is a program that's designed to provide faculty and contract lecturers with opportunities to enhance the impact of their teaching and to participate in a community of educators committed to excellence in teaching and learning. Through the program, you get to design and redesign courses and learning experiences, collaborate with colleagues and center staff in doing this. You'll also receive recognition for your participation in the programming that you can use towards your teaching dossier or portfolio. And I think most importantly, you get a chance to participate in a supportive community of educators and mentors. And so it's a really great way to network and build your connections at TMU and get more involved within the teaching and learning community here at TMU. So the link is there. The links are there in the slides as well if you want to learn more about the ETP. My name is Jackie. Again, I'm an educational developer here at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. I specialize in program evaluation and SoTL, and so this is really my jam. I've led a few national and international projects focused on improving and studying equity, diversity, and inclusion in science education and research. And I also currently serve as an associate editor for the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which is sort of the premier academic journal when it comes to research related to teaching and learning in higher education in Canada. So I'm really excited to be able to organize this series of workshops and to facilitate it. This is the first time we're doing something like this, and so if you have any feedback, there will be a feedback form at the end of this workshop, and you're also certainly more than welcome to reach out to me directly via email. What is SoTL? So I know that some of you may not have had a chance to attend our earlier workshops. So this is just a quick overview of what SoTL is before we dive into the focus of this workshop, which is qualitative research. SoTL projects are projects that are focused on improving student learning and educational experiences. And so these could be research projects that you undertake to better understand how your students are learning, to test out and evaluate a new teaching approach that you have in your courses. It's really anything that you do that's focused on improving how students learn and engaging in practices that strive to make their educational experiences more positive. Typically, SoTL projects will involve students as partners in inquiry and learning. They're guided by questions that are grounded in local context and current knowledge. And so you might be curious, as I think anyone who's taught before, or hopefully has sort of thought about whether what they're doing is useful or effective. Um, Anytime you ask those types of questions of yourself, you can generally use them as sort of the framework to develop a SoTL project. They're conducted using sound and ethical methods, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail today. And you share your findings with others. That's sort of a core tenet of SoTL. It doesn't become scholarship unless you share it with other people. So that could be through peer-reviewed journals. It could be through workshops, conferences, articles, anything that allows you to share what you find with other researchers and educators who might stand to benefit from what you find. And they also include a clearly defined research lens. We all teach in different disciplines, and so SoTL is inherently multidisciplinary. So it's important to think about and to explicate and justify what we define as research when we engage in SoTL work. This is just a nice graphic from the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning that sort of provides an overview of the core tenets of SoTL that I've talked about. If you have any questions as we go through, just feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll try my best to keep up. You're also welcome to raise your hands, and um, we can make this more of a dialogue as opposed to a monologue. This is what I would view as a traditional SoTL project, and so it starts with identifying a problem or question, like any typical research project would start with, conducting a literature review to figure out what's been done and what's been sort of investigated already in regards to the problem or question that you have. Applying for research ethics board approval. So typically in SoTL, we're working and studying students or people in general, which requires some consideration of research ethics. And so if you're curious about that side of things, I encourage you to reach out to TMU's Research Ethics Board. They're sort of the point people to talk to when it comes to all things ethics related. We will touch on this a bit today, but if you have more detailed questions, the Research Ethics Board and their team are the people to reach out to. Gathering and analyzing evidence from through a SoTL project that addresses your problem or question, which we'll talk about today, and then sharing your findings. So our workshop in December focused on developing research questions. Today we're going to be diving into qualitative methods to gather and analyze data. So the learning outcomes for today. By the end of the session, you'll be able to contrast qualitative methods with quantitative methods to explain why and when the former is useful for SoTL research, identify the different ways in which qualitative data can be collected in SoTL, and discuss best practices for collecting and analyzing qualitative data from interviews and focus groups. So what is qualitative research and what is it not? So there's quantitative research, and quantitative research is more akin to that first question we dove into. So testing and examining relationships between specific and measurable variables and applying statistical analyses to what is often numerical data. And so an example of a quantitative research approach might be, maybe you're curious about the relationship between attendance in your course and students' test scores or their performance in the course. And so those are two specific, measurable, and oftentimes numerical measures that you can correlate to get it to answer your question. So that's a quantitative approach to that problem. Qualitative is sort of the opposite. So we're not dealing with numbers, we're dealing with experiences, behaviors, beliefs, feelings, anything that can be really, really difficult to measure numerically. And so in these types of research, we're identifying patterns or themes inductively from open-ended data. And so if we go back to when I asked you all to talk about why you chose the approach that you, or why you chose the location of work that you chose, I could have taken that data and used it to identify patterns or themes from your responses. And from there, I sort of have a general idea of what the reasoning is for people in this group. There are also mixed methods, which I won't talk about in too much detail in this workshop or in this series of workshops. But mixed methods you can sort of think about as a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches. And so an example of this might be you give students in your course a survey. So that's a quantitative, oftentimes a quantitative measure. And then you follow up that survey with a qualitative approach, like interviews or focus groups. And so it's sort of trying to get at the best of both worlds with quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative research, you're focusing on what's present, how much is present. So, how much of a particular perspective or belief is present within your sample. Numerical data and statistics dominates here, and you're often seeking out larger sample sizes. So it's not uncommon for quantitative research to involve upwards of hundreds or thousands of responses. Qualitative research, you're focused on questions like how is something happening, or why do people behave or experience the things that they do, or why do they feel certain things, think about certain things a certain way. So you're analyzing text, images, conducting observations of folks. And so because qualitative research is oftentimes more time intensive, right? It takes much more work and much more time to interview someone for 30 minutes versus just sending out a survey. You're often restricted to smaller sample sizes here. Oh, does someone have a question? No? Okay, let's move on then. Feel free to ask questions in the chat though, if you have a question. One quick thing I'll mention here is that one of the, I think, more common critiques that I hear about qualitative research is that because it's restricted to smaller sample sizes, is that qualitative research is inherently less useful or valuable compared to quantitative research. Uh, and I would argue that that is not necessarily the case. Qualitative research inherently seeks to um, answer different questions from quantitative research. And so sample sizes aren't necessarily a core concern of qualitative research. It's more so you're really just trying to get at richer detail and more detailed insights into what people are thinking and feeling. And so because of that, you're not really too worried about the sample size. You're really just trying to talk to or speak with a select number of people and get their insights on things. So to just hammer this point home one last time, we're trying to get to the why with qualitative research. And so one common question that we ask in chemistry is, asking students to identify some part of a molecule. So this would give us a sense of what they think the most acidic proton is in a molecule. But to really get at the why, we would have to ask a more qualitative question. So to justify their thinking, either by writing about it, by speaking about it, maybe even by drawing. So this would be a set of qualitative data that I could analyze for um, a qualitative investigation. So why might we use qualitative methods? It allows us to explore underlying experiences, meanings, beliefs, etc. They're effective in learning about complex and sometimes intangible factors, and they bring nuance to what are often complex social realities. And so, if quantitative methods give you sort of the breadth of understanding, the tip of the iceberg, qualitative methods give you access to the depth of what people are experiencing or believe, what they believe. And so, it's sort of the stuff under the surface. Any questions at this stage before we move on? No? Okay. Feel free to chime in if anything does come up, but otherwise we'll move on to the second part of this workshop, so which is identifying the different ways in which qualitative data can be collected. So this will be a bit of a shorter section. So what are some types of qualitative research? So Cresswell, John Cresswell, who's cited down here at the bottom, um, sort of a leading scholar when it comes to uh, different methodological approaches in social science research. Talks about 6 different ways that we can approach qualitative research. I wouldn't say that any of these 6 ways is particularly descriptive, or that you should I'm not going to I wouldn't say that you have to feel restricted to one approach versus another. This is more so a vocabulary from which you can start building your own projects and your own approaches to qualitative work. So you can certainly combine some of these. You can certainly take aspects of each of these and incorporate them into a project that you want to carry out in your own context. So the first is phenomenological studies, and so this is research that explores how people experience or understand something. So an example of this might be interviewing students to learn how they feel about the stress of final exams. And so you're focused on a central phenomenon, in this case, the stress of final exams in chemistry, and you're really just wanting to get an understanding of how students are experiencing or understanding this phenomenon. There are ethnographic studies. And so this is a study of a group's culture and daily life by observing and interacting with them. So an example of this might be spending a semester with chemistry students to see how they collaborate in labs and study together. So it's really more observational and more about sort of situating yourself within that group to see how they behave and think over time. There are grounded theory studies, and so these are focused on developing a theory by uncovering patterns within a data set. And so an example of this might be analyzing students' reflections on lab experiments to develop a theory about how hands-on learning impacts their understanding of chemistry concepts. And so the goal here is to develop some sort of more, some broader theory about how students are engaging in a particular idea, or how they're learning about something, how they're learning something by developing or by uncovering patterns within the data that you collect. Historical studies, which I myself haven't had too much experience with. This would involve researching and understanding past events and their impact. And so an example that I came up with here was examining old university policies to understand how chemistry curricula have evolved over time. Case studies, a deep dive into one specific example or situation to learn more about that example or situation. And so an example could be investigating one chemistry class that uses flipped learning to understand how it affects students' engagement. So I think the case study is really just focusing on a single or a few cases, and you're less focused on identifying patterns like in these other approaches. And then the last approach is action research. So this is solving problems by working with others, testing solutions, and learning from the results. And so collaborating with students and faculty to test a new teaching method for the chemistry labs, and then evaluating what works best. And so these are all different approaches, like I said, that you can sort of pull on in different ways and in different, I guess, um, capacities. So you can definitely combine, for example, phenomenological approaches with action research. Maybe you get a sense of how students are feeling about final exams, and then you have a new approach that you want to test out from a more action research perspective that seeks to address the stress levels that you've uncovered in that first phenomenological approach. So again, this is just a more so vocabulary from which you can pull on to develop a more concrete project. Some specific research methods. There are qualitative surveys, like the one I posed to you earlier. These are open-ended questions that allow respondents to provide detailed and descriptive answers, observations, watching and noting behaviors, interactions, etc. Text analysis, examining written content, so books, articles, transcripts, written essays from students, written reports, lab reports that you can use to identify themes, patterns, or meanings. image analysis, interpreting photos, illustrations, or other visual media to similarly identify themes, patterns, or meanings. Interviews, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. These are in-depth discussions with individuals to gather detailed personal insights. And then focus groups, group discussions to explore shared perspectives and generate collective insights. Regardless of which approach you take, what you'll notice, or one thing that's sort of an overarching theme across each of these approaches, is that they require the researchers, you, to generate contextual, descriptive, and interpretive insights from the data collected. It's right. It can be really difficult, or not. How we interpret qualitative data is really up to us. There are frameworks and suggestions and protocols in place in the literature, but qualitative research is an approach that really um, requires the researcher to sort of develop the data, or sorry, to analyze the data from their own perspective and to sort of develop the findings from what they see in the data. Unlike quantitative research, which is much more numeric, uh, some might say more objective because it deals with numbers. Um, some people argue that qualitative research is more subjective and inherently more subjective, and that can be viewed as a limitation, but it can also be viewed as a just a benefit or an inherent part of qualitative work. All right. So let's discuss some best practices for collecting and analyzing qualitative data from interviews and focus groups. Before I dive into this, let me pause for any questions that are coming up. So any questions or comments? Okay. Interviews. So I think we all probably have some idea of what an interview is. It's a fairly broad term that's used in our daily life. An interview is an interchange of views between two or more people about a particular theme or topic. An interview is a specific form of conversation where knowledge is produced through the interaction between an interviewer and an interviewee. So it's really a way for you to talk to people and get their perspective on something that you're interested in. So as an example, if we go back to the in-person versus office debate, rather than asking each of you to describe why you chose what you chose in writing, I could have instead interviewed each of you for 30 minutes to dive more deeply into your thoughts on that topic. So it's a really great way for us to have a conversation, to get really rich, detailed feedback and data on a particular idea or topic. There are two interview methods that I'll mention. So there are semi-structured interviews, and so these are interviews that are guided by a set of predefined questions or topics. So that ensures that there's consistency between the interviews, but they're also flexible enough to explore new ideas that emerge during the conversation. And so I might come into the interview with a set number of questions or set questions that I'm interested in asking you, and as well as all the other participants. But I'm sort of building in some flexibility in case things come up that I didn't anticipate. So that gives you the freedom as the interviewer to give participants options to sort of elaborate on what they're thinking and feeling. There are also narrative interviews where the interviewer provides minimal direction, allowing the interviewee to control the flow, focus, and pace of the conversation to share their story or experiences. There are many different types of questions you can ask in interviews. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it's really up to you. I find that I always try and build questions that align with my overarching research question. And so if you remember back from if you were at our research questions workshop, research questions are sort of the grounding foundation for any project. And so what I like to do is take my research question, have it written down, and then from that, building in my interview questions um, uh, in ways that stem from my overarching research question. So you can ask demographic questions, background questions, descriptive questions, etc. I think the important thing for any sort of interview or focus group question is to keep it open-ended. Um, it doesn't really make sense within the context of an interview or focus group to ask a yes or no question, because that's something that you can ask in a survey or something more quantitative. Interview questions should ideally be, something that asks participants to elaborate on how they feel about something, why they feel a certain way about something, etc. One key component of both interviews and focus groups is building rapport. So rapport is just, I almost like to think of it as like the vibes that you put out into the session or the interview or focus group. Um, you know, it can be kind of awkward sometimes to just have a conversation about something with someone you really don't know, especially if you're an instructor for a course and you're interviewing your students. There can be a power dynamic there that can be challenging to navigate, and for you to get authentic and useful information from participants. And so, rapport is, I would say, is essential to any sort of qualitative investigation. So, being friendly and conversational, using relaxed body language, being patient with participants, showing respect for their contributions, and fostering mutual respect. These are all some strategies that you might incorporate into your interviews and focus groups to help build rapport and to sort of make the space one in which participants feel a bit more comfortable sharing their thoughts and feelings with you. Focus groups. So these are distinct from interviews. These are facilitated group discussions that explore collective views, shared experiences, or joint narratives, often to gather diverse perspectives on a particular topic. So interviews are often one-to-one. Focus groups are more are group oriented. Um, so it's often you, the researcher, with several other people in a room, several other participants. These are not just simultaneous individual interviews. One of the most for me, from my perspective, one of the beautiful things about focus groups is that you can almost get participants to interview each other. Participants can form new perspectives or insights from the interplay and conversation through conversation with other focus group members. And so, in some focus groups I've facilitated in the past, I really just take a step back and I have my set questions that I want people to start the conversation with. But from there, it's really up to the participants to sort of bounce ideas off each other, ask questions of each other, etc. And so in these cases, the interviewer serves more as a moderator or facilitator rather than an interviewer. There were some logistics that I've found useful for facilitating focus groups or logistical components. So having two people, two researchers be part of the focus groups can be helpful because one researcher can lead the discussion by asking respondents or participants to respond to the questions, and then the second can be there to sort of take notes and record general thoughts or themes that emerge during the discussion. There isn't a best group size. I think this is a question that comes up a lot, but what I've found useful and manageable from my own experiences, having between 4 to 6 participants keeps things manageable for you as a facilitator while providing ample opportunities for participation and diverse perspectives amongst your participants. Other tips for moderating focus groups, starting with icebreakers. And so one thing I like to start with in any focus groups is going around the room and getting everyone to introduce themselves, sharing a fun fact or just something that, eases the awkwardness a bit with a very what could be seen or what can feel like a very formal session, and also agreeing on ground rules. And so building rapport early and clearly explaining the expectations and structure of the session before the discussion begins. Encouraging diverse viewpoints. Questions like, does anyone have a different perspective? Or encouraging more quiet folks to chime in if someone hasn't said something in a while. Using silence strategically, so allowing pauses to give participants time to reflect and formulate their answers. And so I think this aligns with the idea that your role in the focus group is really to facilitate and less so to sort of dominate the conversation and steer the conversation a particular way. Limit your involvement. That sort of lines up with what I just said. And then promoting full participation. So I did want to walk us through an example. So this is an example from some of my own work from grad school. So this was a qualitative study that I led, where we conducted focus groups and interviews with chemistry students who were learning English as an additional language. So these were English learners, and the research questions that we had for these participants were focused on what language barriers they had faced in learning, communicating, and doing chemistry, and also wanting to learn more about what strategies and supports they've found helpful and or needed. So in this research, I facilitated focus groups and interviews with students. We gave people the option. And so one of the things I like to do in this kind of work now is to give people the option to choose between an interview and focus group. Each has their own pros and cons. Fortunately, we had the resources and time to do both. Some people might prefer to do an interview. Some people might prefer to do a focus group. So we liked giving them that option. So I facilitate these focus groups and interviews. And I'm going to use this example as a way for us to walk through sort of the timeline of what qualitative data looks like. And so we had these conversations, these focus groups and interviews. Um, we recorded them. And so one thing that you can do rather than just taking notes is record the conversations that you have with folks. So for us, these conversations were held over Zoom. And so that made it really easy for us to take the conversations and turn them into audio files. And then to make the analysis process easier, you can take the recordings, the audio files, and transcribe them into text. So there are some tools that I like to use for this. Zoom actually has a transcription component to it. And so you can, if you're doing your interviews and focus groups over Zoom, you can actually just get a transcription straight out of Zoom. There are also these AI tools nowadays like Otter, where you can take the audio file and input it into the software, and it will generate a transcript of the audio file immediately. Um, Again, this is also subject to some of the ethical concerns that I shared earlier in response to Elizabeth's question. So I'd be mindful of that anytime you're sort of uploading participant data into these external tools. From there, you have these transcripts, and so the qualitative data analysis process can look something like this. So generally, what we're trying to do with qualitative data is extract the underlying themes, patterns from what can be a very complex, chaotic uh, series of ideas from participants. So what we did in this research was analyze the transcripts line by line. And so what this looks like is taking the transcripts and literally combing through each sentence, each idea expressed in the transcripts and highlighting those ideas on a line by line basis. And so the colors here are meant to represent individual ideas being expressed within each transcript that we analyzed. From there, it makes it much easier to sort of take the individual ideas and group them into patterns. And so each color that you see in these transcripts has now been grouped into a pattern. So it might be pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And so here we're getting to a point where we're sort of inductively taking what we see in the transcript and using it to generate patterns across participants' experiences and thoughts. From there, we might have specific themes that we're noticing across different patterns, and this is where we sort of start grouping patterns into overarching themes. And these might be aligned with your research questions. So one thing that we did in our research was take our research questions and use them to sort of organize which patterns could be grouped together. This is just one approach. So other methods like discourse analysis, narrative analysis, and content analysis can be used to explore different aspects of the data. The Saldana resource that I've shared down here has some resources on those approaches. But generally in qualitative analysis, it's generally follows this approach. You have your transcript, which is open-ended, chaotic, open to interpretation. You analyze the transcripts for the ideas that are present in them. From those ideas that you identify, you start grouping them into patterns and then theming them to get your overarching findings. These are some tools I like to use for qualitative analysis. So NVivo is the big one that most people use. This is just a way. So an example of this is an example transcript from an interview. Um, so you have interviewer, participant Mark here. And what NVivo allows you to do is sort of highlight sections of a transcript and label and code them, what we call coding. Um, Basically labeling specific sections of transcripts to identify specific ideas. Um, and so in this statement, what this researcher has identified is that Mark, the interviewee, is talking about water consumption sustainability. And so it allows you to sort of highlight specific ideas that are being expressed in your interviews or focus groups. TMU faculty and staff get free access to NVivo, so you can download NVivo by following this link down below or by scanning this QR code. There are a ton of resources out there too for how to best use NVivo videos. I think NVivo even has its own manual. So if you want to dive more deeply into using NVivo effectively, there are resources out there. One thing I have started using more for qualitative analysis are online whiteboards like Miro. And so Miro is, if you ever used an online whiteboard, it's basically it's an online whiteboard, right? So it's a way for you to sort of map out ideas. And so one thing I like to do is once I've analyzed the transcript for the specific ideas through that line by line process I talked about, I import each of those ideas into the sticky notes on an online whiteboard like Miro. And from there, it makes it much easier for me to sort of drag around each idea or sticky note into these groups. And so in this case, this is an example where the ideas are related to user feedback. And so the researchers have started grouping the ideas under these patterns. So accessibility, user perks, inclusivity, gamification, etc. So it's I think, a more visual way to start identifying patterns and themes once you have the key ideas extracted from your data. And so this is what we found from our research. It was taking those transcripts, identifying the key ideas, grouping those ideas into patterns, and then organizing them into themes. And these are the themes that we found in our work. I won't dive into the results, but if you want to learn more or read more about this, there's the link to the reference down below there. I'll just quickly go over some ethical considerations per Beverly's question earlier in the chat. So each of these components is an essential thing to consider and think about when developing any research project involving human beings. And so specifically for interviews and focus groups, voluntary participation, ensuring participants understand that they can opt out of the conversation or the project at any time without consequences. Anonymity and confidentiality. So anytime you share quotes, for example, it's important that you use pseudonyms and securely store data to protect participant identities. Like I said earlier, with focus groups, it could be challenging to ensure confidentiality. So it's important to recognize that and to just try and encourage confidentiality as much as possible within your participants. Privacy, conducting interviews in a private setting and avoiding sharing sensitive personal information in focus groups. Clearly outlining potential emotional discomfort or highlighting any societal or personal benefits of participating in the project. Participation tasks, explaining the nature and duration of the sessions and what participants will be expected to discuss. Incentives, and so if you have funding for your project, it's generally nice to have something to give to participants without pressuring participants to join. And so there are some suggestions on what is deemed like an acceptable level of incentive. And so um, yeah, it's nice to give people something for their time and for their contribution. and also who to contact. So providing contact details for the researcher and ethics review board for questions or concerns. So these are all things that you might include in the consent form for your project. In your research ethics application, these are all things to consider and talk about. The REB here at TMU has some consent form templates for focus groups and interviews. And so I encourage you to check those out as a starting point if you're curious about things to talk about in those types of documents. All right. I've been talking a lot. So I'll quickly summarize what we've talked about today, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments. And so qualitative research really helps us to explore the why. Why do people believe certain things, behave in certain ways, etc.? These can be collected, qualitative data can be collected using various methods, including observations, open-ended surveys, interviews, and focus groups. Having clear goals and protocols, establishing participant rapport, and considering the ethical implications of your work are key to facilitating effective interviews and focus groups. So hopefully this gives you sort of a broad overview of qualitative work. These are some examples of things I've shared today. So some of the work that I've been a part of, some work here at TMU led by one of our teaching fellows at the center, Dr. Yukari Siko, who led a mixed methods approach actually to in her own work, and then some other resources that I think are really valuable ways to frame qualitative research. Some resources on best practices for qualitative interviews and focus groups, and then some best practices for analyzing qualitative data. That is it for this workshop. So if you're interested in quantitative methods in SoTL, we'll have another workshop on that topic in February. And then the last workshop in the series for this year will be on using SoTL research to inform your teaching, which will be in March. And we do have a workshop feedback survey. So again, this is the first time that we're hosting this SoTL workshop series. And so I'd love to hear any feedback that you have about these workshops, because it's the first time we're doing them. And I really want to make sure that we're hitting all the right notes and needs that people want from these types of sessions. So